Hi, it's Rob from East Coast Sailing. Today I'm going to show you how to remove the drive shaft and change the Cutless bearing, as well as the inside where we're going to change the stern seal. It's quite a straightforward job, but I think the difficult part was actually removing the drive shaft itself. So one of the first questions you might be wondering is, how do I know when my Cutless bearing needs to be replaced? Literature suggests that every 10 years or 10,000 engine hours, the Cutless bearing should be replaced as a precaution. Now there's many variables that will affect the life expectancy of that part. If you've had the engine shaft alignment out and the engine's been running, you're going to wear away a side wall of the Cutless bearing, and that's going to reduce its lifespan. And if your boat regularly dries out in the mud or it's located in sandy areas, all those deposits will get caught in the Cutless bearing and wear it out prematurely. You also might feel a significant vibration, and that's because there's possibly play between the Cutless bearing and the drive shaft as it's rotating and it's banging on the side of the wall. Now I didn't have that problem. When I grabbed on the end of the propeller and gave it a good wiggle, I couldn't see any play, and that's because all the Cutless bearing and material had actually overheated because the channels had worn away, and that had actually fused onto the drive shaft, packed out the diameter of the drive shaft, so there was no play. A Cutless bearing has no moving parts. It draws fresh seawater in like an Archimedes screw as the drive shaft and the propeller rotate. The fresh seawater provides lubrication. That's why those channels are so critical in drawing in fresh seawater, because as soon as they reduce in height, it stops the ability to keep the drive shaft and the Cutless bearing cool and lubricated, which will accelerate the wear. This is a side-by-side comparison of the new Cutless bearing on the left and the worn one on the right. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, these are the conditions of the screws that held in the Cutless bearing, and if these failed, I dread to think what would have happened. There was a telltale sign. It was very stiff to turn. I had two hands in it, and you'll see later on in the video of me trying to turn the drive shaft, but the engine's in neutral and it was very resistant. So you'll see when I've put the new Cutless bearing in and a new drive shaft, unfortunately at the cost of £640, how freely that spins after I've replaced both those components. Now unfortunately I found a load of pitting and wear patterns and scoring on the drive shaft. Now that's normally not an issue if that's not where the Cutless bearing or the stern seal goes, but unfortunately it was in both those locations. So I had to bite the bullet and get a new drive shaft made at French Marine, which is based in Brighton-on-Sea, and they managed to turn that around in a couple of days. And that's why you might hear that phrase in the boatyard, boat stands for breakout another 1,000, and it couldn't be more applicable in this situation. Now this job was created when I was going over the gory folding propeller, and I thought it was just a case of changing the anodes as well as polishing up the propeller blades. I found so many things wrong with the unit. I thought the best course of action was to remove the drive shaft and the propeller from the boat and get it in the garage so I could do a thorough inspection. I think the results speak for themselves, so if you haven't seen that video, go and check it out. So start off by propping some wood under the drive shaft so it's supported and it's not going to damage the GRP stern tube. Then undo those 4 bolts that are holding the coupling drive shaft to the back of the engine, and they are 17mm spanners you'll need. Once all the bolts are undone, slide the drive shaft back to give yourself some room, because you're going to have to access this M16 bolt that holds the coupler on. Prop some wood under the propeller to stop it spinning so you can undo the M16 bolt. You'll need a 24mm socket to undo this, and remember when you're looking at the bolt, it's lefty-loosey and righty-tighty. Now this is where the fun and games really began with this job. I tried a small 3-arm puller to try and eject the drive shaft from the engine connection plate, but that didn't seem to budge it. I sprayed loads of WD-40 oil inside the hub connection plate to try and free the drive shaft. Just be careful not to get oil onto the stern seal, because it will perish the rubber and lead to a leak. The penetrating oil didn't seem to work, so I got a mini hammer and tried to shock the joint to try and free the two components apart, and that didn't work. I even tried the bigger puller and that was defeated, and it was also difficult to add tension in the engine bay because it started getting very near the engine. I even gave my harmonic dampener tool a go, so I put a socket inside which would be used to push out the drive shaft while I tightened the nuts up on the harmonic dampener puller to try and eject the drive shaft, and lo and behold, that didn't even work. The solution that actually worked was by putting a smaller socket inside of a bigger socket, and I also bought some oversized 70mm M10 bolts. I did the bolts up hand tight and then began torquing them sequentially, doing quarter of a turn at a time, and eventually that put enough pressure and ejected the drive shaft. With some pressure, it literally just popped out there. I just heard this ting and it all looks good. Thank God for that. It was a terrible job. So now I can just undo these bolts. There's lots of small parts that you could possibly lose once you get the engine mounting plate off the end of the drive shaft, so have a container on hand. Behind the M16 nut there's a small brass washer. And this is the offending engine connection plate that was seized onto the end of the drive shaft. I believe it was so difficult to remove because the components hadn't been disassembled since the boat was manufactured in 2006, which is 18 years. I believe Beneteau also used a mild steel keyway instead of a stainless steel keyway because it's got lots of rust and corrosion. Remove the 2 Allen key bolts that hold the stern seal to the stern tube. Slide off the stern seal, and now we're ready to remove the drive shaft from the shaft log. Finally, after 3 broken pullers, I got the drive shaft out, which justifies a celebration dance. Unfortunately, there was some deep scoring across the drive shaft where the Cutless bearing went, as well as lots of pitting. The pitting would have caused localised heat spots which would have worn away the new Cutless bearing as well as the stern seal. There's 2 retaining bolts that need to be undone on the stern tube that hold the Cutless bearing in. These bolts have rusted out and been heavily affected by crevice corrosion. If the Cutless bearing backed out, it would have meant the drive shaft would have been unsupported, leading to a major water leak and loss of the engine. After the screws were removed, we could pull out the Cutless bearing, which came out really easily. If you're really struggling to remove one of those bronze Cutless bearings, then insert some threaded rod into the stern tube, put a couple of nuts on the end, and then you can thread some sockets over, one the same size as the stern seal and then one that's slightly oversized. Then put a couple of nuts on the end, and then you can use this as a sliding hammer. And that should pull the Cutless bearing out. You can see the channels on the bottom left are completely warm, which would have starved it from water, which meant it would have had no lubrication and would have overheated. The front of the Cutless bearing looks okay, and it's just the back, so I think there was a misalignment of the shaft. You'll need to take a couple of dimensions to order the new Cutless bearing. You need to know the internal diameter of the stern tube as well as the diameter of the drive shaft. Measure the drive shaft accurately because it's easy to confuse 1 inch with 25mm as 1 inch is 25.4mm. Also measure the retaining screw offset from the back of the Cutless bearing. Insert the Cutless bearing into the stern tube and make sure the holes are lined that retain the Cutless bearing. The plastic retaining screws that came with the Cutless bearing looked a little bit flimsy, so I opted to make my own out of M6 stainless steel and cut them down to size. I put my finger inside the Cutless bearing and felt the walls, and I could feel the retaining screws were pushing the Cutless bearing walls out slightly, so I had to trim them down. I'm using Loctite 243, which can be used underwater, but it does need 24 hours to cure, and this is what's used in gory folding propellers. I moved the stern support stand out of the way so I could get the new drive shaft in, and I put some fairy liquid over the Cutless bearing to protect it when I was sliding it in. Some more fairy up liquid and a quick air guitar solo. I installed the new drive shaft just before launch day because I didn't want anything shiny lying around in the boatyard. Finally, this was the last item that completed the boat ready for the launch. Once the drive shaft was aligned, it glided into the Cutless bearing, and look how smoothly it spins round. Once the drive shaft's inserted, put the stern seal over the stern tube. Clip in the drive shaft keyway, slide on the drive shaft connecting plate, put the brass washer over the threaded drive shaft connection, and then add the M16 bolt. Put some wood under the drive shaft to support it before we torque down the M16 bolt. Prop some wood under the propeller to stop the drive shaft spinning. Now the drive shaft's locked into position, we can begin doing up the M16 bolt, and you'll require a 24mm socket. Before torquing down the 4 bolts that holds the drive shaft to the back of the engine crank, we need to check for shaft alignment. If you put 3 plastic packers between the drive shaft and the shaft log, you'll keep that drive shaft nice and central. If the drive shaft isn't central, it's going to put uneven wear on the Cutless bearing and the stern seal, which will lead to problems later down the line. You can probably see that I've changed the engine vibration mounts, which means I had to readjust the engine height to get it perfectly aligned to the engine drive shaft. I will make a separate video on shaft alignment because it's quite a big topic and it will be too long to cover in this video. After adjusting the height of the rear of the engine and moving it from left to right, I got the engine alignment perfect. I had the shaft alignment done so accurately I couldn't even get my smallest feeler gauge in at any point around the 2 mounting plate surfaces. Torque down the 4 original drive shaft connecting bolts, remove the temporary packers between the drive shaft and the stern log, and finally we can put the stern seal on. The replacement stern seal comes with a tube of grease and it's £150 for an official Volvo Penta one. You can get cheaper replacements which are about £80, but I wouldn't take the risk because it costs £700 to get my boat lifted in and out the water. I got my replacement parts from Pirates Cave. The kit comes with a rubber stern seal with a protective collar, some Allen keys, you also get an anti-pinch tab and this amazing blue waterproof grease. The stern seal should be replaced every 5 years at every 500 engine hours, and every 200 engine hours you should squeeze in 1 cm cubed of grease into the stern seal. Slide over the compression collar, bend the anti-pinch metal around the profile of the stern seal and slide it directly under the clamping faces where they meet. Tighten up both Allen key bolts until they're both bottomed out and there's no gap between the meeting faces. Remove the orange protective collar, squeeze the stern seal together, which will give you a little bit of clearance between the drive shaft and the stern seal, and then put 1 cm cubed of blue grease in. Clear off any excess grease from the drive shaft as well as the stern seal, as this will attract dirt and debris. And finally, the boat's ready to go back in the water, and I'm sure you'll agree it looks fantastic. Hopefully you've learned something new in today's episode and it inspires you to do this job yourself. And I think it's really important knowing everything about your boat because no one's going to help you when you're out at sea. Now, if you want to help sponsor the channel, you can buy a beer on Buy Me a Coffee in the link in the description, and I'll give you a shout out in the next video and your name will appear on the bottle. You can either buy some of the East Coast Sailing apparel and 5% of the profits go to the RNLI and the rest of the profits go back into the channel to buy more camera equipment and make the content better. So if you like what you see, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment, it just helps push those videos up in the algorithm.